Hi, I'm MissPlissken, and today I'm building the super creepy manor from the Crimson Peak movie called Allerdale Hall. Alright, so terrible news. The Crimson Peak house is not real, and the whole thing, exterior and interior, was built just for the movie. But I'm not going to let something like this house being a complete work of fiction stop me. I wanted to talk about the real-life architectural inspiration for the house, where I see real-life similarities to grand English manor houses, and where I see totally made-up fantasy elements. It seemed like it'd be kind of a fun thing to take something a bit fantastical and try to analyze it a bit. Let me know if you like this kind of thing, digging into fictional buildings to find true-to-life elements. Oh, and also I wanted to build something big and spooky and period appropriate to give me an excuse to talk about how the Victorians were straight up obsessed with death and all things macabre. So let me start with the house and what the heck is going on here. Okay, so clearly this house was designed to be big and weird and look fantastic on camera. The house is intended to be a Gothic style building, which makes total sense given the vibe of the movie. I just love a good period piece that goes all out with set design and costumes. Now, I can't tell you how historically accurate the costumes are, but I'm going to take a crack at the set. A lot of it is pretty funky, so let the judging commence. So let's start with the exterior. Honestly, beautiful, love this. This is what Vlad's mansion should have been. That said, I can't say it's all that realistic. There's an art book of the movie, and it gives a bit of lore for the Sharp family and the house, and it says that the house was built around 1660. And I've got beef with this. So Gothic architecture wasn't popular for residential buildings at this time. It's probably like 100 years too late for Gothic and 100 years too early for Gothic revival. To give you an idea of what's popular and what's going on in England with big houses in the 1600s, we've got a bit of Tudor architecture still hanging on a little bit, so think half timbering and a lot of prominent front-facing gables. There's also Elizabethan styles that are popular. Think Hardwick Hall, more window than wall. That's the quintessential Elizabethan house. There's also Jacobean styles, like the gatehouse of Stanway House. That's a good example of that. And you're also starting to see a transition into more classical architecture styles, like the Baroque and Italianate Chatsworth House. And none of these houses look like Crimson Peak. Since it doesn't look like any of the popular styles, I had to do a little bit more digging to find something similar. The south elevation of Apthorpe Palace, which was built in 1622, and that is very close to our 1660 target date, looks promisingly similar. But notice how steeply pitched the roof of Crimson Peak is compared to Apthorpe Palace. I can't get over it. Honestly, to me, it looks straight up Victorian Gothic revival, which is like 100 years later. And I mean, it makes sense because all of the creepy haunted houses are Victorian. But not only does the timing of the Gothic style not line up, it really doesn't resemble a 16th or 17th century Gothic facade of any home I could find, and I tried. Although I will admit I did not do an exhaustive survey of every single manor house and palace built in the 1600s, I think part of the issue is that every time I found a promising example of similar architecture, it was Gothic revival, like Bearwood House, built in the late 1800s, Margam House, built in the 1830s, the Elms in Arbroath, built in the 1850s, which looks like kind of a cute little mini version of Crimson Peak. So I give up. I'm going insane trying to figure this house out. My first instinct was that it looked like a Victorian Gothic revival, and I'm sticking to it. That being said, that does not mean I'm completely disregarding the lore created for this house. A lot of these large prodigy homes were extensively renovated over the years in multiple styles, so it's not crazy to think that Crimson Peak was built in 1660, but maybe they overhauled the facade in the late 1700s when Gothic revival took off, and by the time the 1880s rolled around, when the movie takes place, the whole thing had been neglected. And that works, and it really does look like the house has been lived in for generations and expanded in kind of a piecemeal, haphazard sort of way. The Great Hall looks like a much older style than the facade, with a totally amazing hammer beam roof, and I'm thinking it's giving me the Great Hall at Hampton Court vibes. I mean, maybe not quite as fancy as Hampton Court, but still, amazing roof details. Another notable interior space in the Crimson Peak Manor is the entry hall. I love so many details here. First of all, the multi-story grand staircase is on point, and also another reason why this house looks like it was built later than 1660. The stairwells of homes built around that time weren't typically front and center to the front door. Usually they were kind of off to the side, with the Great Hall being the first big main room that you enter after the little front door vestibule. That is a tiny nitpick, I admit, but I do want to point out that the giant hole in the roof turned into a makeshift skylight is funny because skylights in the interior rooms were totally a thing. If you don't have an exterior wall to put a window in the ceiling. So when I built this, I made this room have a skylight instead of a hole in the ceiling. An acceptable compromise in my opinion. This whole space gives me serious Gothic church vibes. The main focal point at the top of the stairs looks like a church altar. There's even a little gold figure there that I have no idea what it is, but it kind of looks pretty Virgin Mary-ish. There's also something that looks very similar to a minstrel's gallery to the left of the stairs. This is something that you see above the entrance in medieval great halls, and it would be where the musicians would play, sort of hidden above the hall. I love this detail. Here in Crimson Peak, it's just a little balcony overlooking the staircase from a hallway, but still, it really does look like it takes inspiration from a minstrel gallery. While we're speaking of the interior, I didn't get the floor plan even remotely close to the movie set. The entry hall, the Great Hall, and the master suite are pretty close, but the attic space wasn't large enough for the sister's bedroom, so I moved that down to the second floor, and since I moved that down, I didn't have room on the second floor for the scary spiky hallway, so I moved the scary spiky hallway to the attic. Which, if we're being architecturally nitpicky, and we are, makes no sense, because there's no way anyone would commission such an elaborate and expensive piece of woodworking and stick it in the attic. The fancier rooms with the fanciest details are always going to be closer to the public eye, so your guests can gawk at how rich you are. Although, maybe having such an extravagant woodwork away from the public eye just goes to show how unconventional the family is. I don't know, it's a stretch. I'm gonna take it so I can put this dang hallway in the attic. Another change I made was moving the kitchen to the basement. I can't be sure exactly where the kitchen is. I think it's sort of directly off the entrance hall, which is very weird to me, but I added a formal dining room there and I put the kitchen directly below it. And I just love cramming kitchens in basements if you can't tell. And a bit of a random addition is I added a servants' corridor that runs parallel to the length of the Great Hall. A perfect place to stash your victims' belongings, or just to keep your servants out of view while they toil around the manor. Practically speaking, I really liked this idea a lot because by the 1500s, this is when servants started transitioning into invisibility, by which I mean houses were built to hide servants by any means possible. Hidden corridors, underground tunnels, sneaky doors. A lot of thought was put into how servants could navigate the house to get all the crap done, but not actually be seen doing it. Roofing this house was an absolute nightmare and a half, but I am super proud of the vaulted ceiling I managed to create in the Great Hall. I downloaded these gable trim pieces from PRSim, and I lined them up underneath the roof, deleted the ceiling, and bam! A pretty good interpretation of a hammer beam roof, if I do say so myself. Most of the other main decorative features of the house are all custom content. I have a ton by Felixander, primarily the Schwerin, Gothic, London, Florence, Berlin, Paris, Georgian, and Colonial sets. And I've also got some railing pieces from King Falcon, and I am so sorry, I know it's a lot of CC, but I kind of had to go crazy on the exterior details. And I also went crazy on the interior details by mainly making it look very dirty. The Strangerville floor stains, the Bust the Dust piles, and the vampire's spider webs and wall cracks are doing a lot of heavy lifting to make this whole place look in total shambles. It's clear this house has been neglected for a very long time. I mean, there's a massive hole in the roof, though my version does have a skylight instead for practical purposes, and there's red clay oozing up ominously through the floorboards. What an omen. The whole house is slowly sinking into the clay, ultimately to be consumed and destroyed by the very resource that provided the means to build the house in the first place. Ooh, suddenly I'm doing a film analysis. Honestly, way scarier than any ghost is the thought of how extensive and expensive the foundation damage is if you've got wet clay seeping right up under the floor. That bill would be terrifying. My point is, the house is in a little bit of a state, and the thing is, very old, very large houses need an absolute insane amount of routine maintenance, and all that maintenance comes at a pretty high price. For a little bit of context, Sudeley Castle costs over $700,000 per year to maintain, Hatfield House costs over $1 million per year to maintain, and granted, those are much larger houses and have extensive gardens and staff, but we're still talking hundreds of thousands of dollars just to keep up. And that's just straight up maintenance. If you want to talk about like refurbishment, like replacing a roof, updating electrical and plumbing, then you're definitely in the millions of dollars range. There was an old BBC show called Restoration Home that documented these sorts of renovations of dilapidated historic buildings. Really interesting stuff, and I do think that you can find old episodes still on YouTube, but also extremely expensive. This sort of explains why about 40% of UK's historic estates are open to the public for tours and offer things like TV, film, and wedding venue bookings because they've got to pay the bills somehow. Building this creepy house was really just an excuse to talk about the Victorians and their weird obsession with death and the occult, and it's such an interesting dichotomy to me since the stereotypical image that you've got of Victorians is, uptight and formal, very reserved. And some historians speculate that this fascination that the Victorians had with the occult came about as a reactionary movement in response to the sudden technological advances and the extreme push toward rational scientific thought at the beginning of the 19th century. And I kind of think that theory makes a lot of sense. It seems like it's a very on-brand human behavior to be a little bit contrarian. And there were a lot of people willing to cash in on the popularity of occultism. William Hope was one of the many who did some very early photoshopping in order to create something called spirit photography. The photographers claimed they could capture the spirits of the deceased through their photography. The photographers would do things like take advantage of the required long exposure time of early cameras and have a person stand behind the subject for just a second, so only a faint hint of another person would be seen in the background, or double expose photographs to essentially combine multiple photographs onto one print, and then, of course, charge money for them. Tarot card readings, palm readings, and crystal gazing were all really popular during the Victorian era too. And to be fair, a good portion of the time, these would be sort of like festive parlor games done for fun, but there were also a fair number of people who were quite taken with the idea of communicating with the dead and being able to see the future, so quite a few people got swindled out of some major cash. But fraudsters beware, because fortune-telling was actually illegal in England under the Witchcraft Act of 1735 and the Vagrancy Act of 1824. Another group of scammers, spiritualists, called the Fox Sisters, created an entire seance business when what started out as a prank on their parents sorta spiraled out of control. They'd go to people's homes or public halls and translate messages from the spirits, which came to them in the form of knocking sounds. For a fee, of course. Many people were skeptical. They often got called fraudsters, but no one could debunk the trick. It wasn't until one of the sisters was interviewed by a magazine some 40 years later that she revealed that they would make knocking noises by cracking their joints. Ugh. So there you go. Scam debunked. Or is it? A year later, she recanted her confession and claimed the spirits had implored her to fake a confession. So I guess we'll never know. And the Fox Sisters weren't the only ones in on communicating with the dead. Seances, Ouija boards, and spirit slates were all the rage. Everyone wanted to talk to the dead. But geez, give them some rest already. But anyhow, death was big business in the Victorian era. If you were unfortunate enough to be made a widow in the 19th century, your burden had only just begun. Widows were heavily judged if they didn't appear to be mourning enough for their dearly deceased husbands, and would go to elaborate ends just to show how they were, in fact, sad. And so they covered themselves head to toe with black crepe fabric. This was fabric that was dyed and chemically treated, easily wrinkled and stained, smelled bad, very heavy, and also really expensive. Fantastic. If this fabric got wet, say with raindrops or tears, The dye would leach out of the fabric and stain your skin, and the fabric would get all faded and discolored. So not only are you struggling under the emotional weight of a loved one's passing, you're now struggling under the physical weight of this terrible fabric that will turn you purple. Oh yeah, and of course the chemicals used to treat the fabric were poisonous. Doctors at the time recommended women not wear mourning clothes because of how toxic wearing a heavy crepe veil was, but real mourners could not be dissuaded. What would people say? The self-imposed chains of etiquette. Love it. But worry not, dear widows, because full mourning clothes were only expected to be worn for 2 years. Fantastic. Death and despair. Anyway, we're coming up to the end of the build, and I really hope you enjoyed this fictional build. It was a little bit different than what I normally do. And stick around to the very end for some glamour shots, and let me know in the comments if you have any building or architecture style requests. I write them all down and I'm keeping track, I promise. And thank you so much for all of the suggestions you've given me so far. I love them all. And if you're interested in architecture and history, please consider subscribing. I have many more of these videos planned, and thank you so much for watching.